Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are now recording our session. Good afternoon to those on the East Coast and good morning to those out west. My name is Elise Gould and I'm a senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute, where I primarily do research on the labor market. I'd like to welcome you to our panel on the limitations and prospects for the future of flexible and remote work. We have 4 speakers and to discuss and to squeeze into 60 minutes, so let's get started. I'm going to introduce all the panelists now so we can save time later. First up is Vanessa Conzon.
That's fine. It's a rare surname and we always debate in my family how to say it, so I have no preference.
All right. Vanessa is an assistant professor of management and organization at Boston College's Carroll School of Management. Her research explores how employees and managers negotiate and attempt to reconcile employees' autonomy with organizational goals. Next, we have Megan Lawrence. Megan is an assistant professor at Vanderbilt Owen Graduate School of Management. She studies how firms adapt over time by selecting and implementing new organizational and management practices and structures. Third up, we have Victoria Sencevko. Victoria is an assistant professor of strategy at INSEAD, where she teaches an MBA elective on organizational design, incentives, and PhD courses on strategy. Our fourth paper will be presented by Peter Norlander, an associate professor of management and director of the HRER program at Loyola University Chicago Quinlan School of Business. Following their presentations, Tomasz Teodorovitz will discuss. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard Business School, and he'll be joining the Department of Strategy and Innovation at the Copenhagen Business School as an assistant professor in August 2022. Congratulations to you. His research studies how organizations mobilize and deploy knowledge, human capital, and technology resources to achieve superior private and social performance and to adapt to the future of work. So let's go ahead and get started. Vanessa, take it away.
Hello, I'm going to share my slides. Okay, can everyone see that? Nodding. Okay, great, awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Elise, for kicking us off. I'm going to put my timer on because I know we have a tight 10 minutes and I don't want to go over time. So I'm presenting today on a paper I'm working on, was part of my dissertation, entitled Gendered Constraints and Role Performances, Gender Differences and How Managers Respond to Gender Equality Related Policies. And as you'll see, the policy I'm talking about specifically here is flexible work. So we know that there has been an increasing number of policies implemented in organizations aimed at reducing gender inequality. Yet despite this, we still, of course, see inequality persisting in organizations. Recently, scholars have been focusing on managers' role in implementing these policies and ultimately improving gender inequality. And in particular, recently, like a large group of studies have focused specifically on managers' gender. So the question of if male managers or female managers are more likely to implement these policies. And often these papers have been drawing on theories related to identity or status. So a simple example would be, and a common argument is that a woman might be more likely to implement these policies because other women are members of their in-group and they want to help other women succeed in the organization. However, when we look at the actual empirical results of these studies, findings are mixed. So some studies do find that women are more likely to implement these policies. Others find men managers, though, are actually more likely, and still other studies find no gender difference. Scholars have recently suggested that focusing on more fine-grained studies can help us uncover unaccounted for mechanisms, which might help us unpack these mixed findings. So to this end, I'm drawing on data from a 26-month ethnography of the implementation of a flexible work policy at an organization of STEM consultants. So the organization had 47 units, each had its own manager and separate group of employees, and the focus of the work was to develop technical projects for clients. So you'll see that I'll be using the term technical and clients a lot as we go through the presentation. And I performed over 400 hours of field work and 142 interviews. And this was, my dissertation work took place before the pandemic. But after the pandemic began, I also performed additional data collection to help confirm the results of the study. So as I was researching, I was really struck by something that I refer to as the policy support paradox. So in particular, there was a contradiction, between managers' support for gender equality and work-family balance versus their implementation of the flexible work policy. So I think, my common sense, expectation had been, okay, if you're supporting gender equality, work-family balance, you're going to support this flexible work policy. And that was not the case. So in particular, male managers were often, not particularly vocal or open about supporting gender equality and work-family balance. Many had stay-at-home wives, and this was just in their mind, not an issue or a problem that needed to be, proactively addressed by the organization. It wasn't a top issue for them. Yet, surprisingly to me, they sort of passively support the policies and allowed employees to use the policy freely. So manager Samuel explained, I have no concerns about the flexible work policy. There have been no challenges, and many employees in his unit spoke about, using the policy regularly. In contrast, women managers regularly articulate support for gender equality and work-family balance in the workplace. So for instance, manager Tiffany explained, I'm trying to set a tone in my unit that work-family balance is okay. And she and other women managers often support things like implementing breastfeeding, lactation room in the organization and a women mentorship club. Yet despite this, I found that many of the women managers opposed the policy, the flexible work policy, and limited employees' use of it. So as manager Brent explained, we don't want to explain use of the policy or encourage use of the policy. And I saw women and men in her unit, as well as in other women managers units, using the policy less and feeling like they weren't allowed to. So as I'm going to describe in the remainder of my talk, I found that the key to unraveling this paradox is something I refer to as gendered constraints and role performances. So in particular, how gendered constraints shaped how these men and women managers enacted their role day to day. So I'll give, more specifics of that as I go through. So in particular, again, at this, technical consulting organization, male managers explained early in their career, they were encouraged to or interested in engaging in more technical and client-facing work. So for instance, manager Ron, I won't read that whole thing, but explained, early on, he sought out and he was assigned to many high profile, high impact, high visibility projects. As managers, so after promotion, they continued to focus on this technical and client-facing work, which was on a day-to-day basis, relatively independent of subordinates. So think of them in their office, working on a project, going, traveling, meeting clients to develop projects. Although they would work sometimes with their subordinates, their focus really was on this technical work and their clients. So as manager Jim explained, I'm really busy with technical work, so I don't have time to babysit people. Now, because the flexible work policy did not actually challenge this pattern of managerial activity, they tended to passively support and implement it. So to explain that a little bit more, the flexible work policy, yes, allowed employees to work at different times and places, but these managers did not experience the policy as making it difficult for them to perform their own role as they viewed it, in particular, performing technical and client-facing work. So as manager Gerald explained, I have employees who use the flexible work policy and it's fine. Everything is basically the same for me as before. So even though employees were working more flexibly on a day-to-day basis, it didn't really affect him. Now, in contrast, women managers describe being pushed into fewer technical and client-facing tasks earlier in the career, so before they became managers. As manager Lori explained, I went into management because I realized I'm responsible for managing half of my unit, I might as well manage the whole unit. So she had, even before she was officially a manager, been given a lot of these people management tasks. And she went on to explain how she viewed her people managing skills, as much stronger than her technical skills. And they had been before her promotion as well as a manager. So then as these women moved into managerial roles, what they ended up really focusing on is working with their employees, helping their employees get access to information and resources that they would learn about from other subordinates and really connecting people to each other. So this activity, almost by definition, is very dependent on their subordinates, because they needed to meet with their subordinates regularly to learn what was happening in the unit and also pass on information to be helpful. So as manager Jennifer explained, my role is to make sure that people have their information and resources they need to do their job, whether it is a purely morale thing or whatever kind of support that they need. And also, whenever I present this, I like to pause and explain that briefly. Employees appreciated the women manager style and on average were more satisfied with how women managers were managing because they appreciated being involved and helped with day to day, in contrast to, sort of exaggerated versions of micromanaging. However, the problem was that when the flexible work policy was rolled out and employees were given the option to work at different times and places, it made it more difficult for women managers to connect with employees regularly at these regular times and places because they were just not in the office. So manager Jennifer went on to explain the flexible work policy takes time out of the day when you can more or less count on staff being around to meet and talk. They can now work later in the evening, for instance. So she was just not as able to easily connect with employees. So the policy seemed to threaten, the way she carried out her role. And she talked also in the interview about how she felt like she was sort of losing control and making her job very, very difficult with the flexible work policy. And therefore she opposed it and didn't encourage her employees to use it. So in summary, I see the paper contributing to two literatures here. So one, this gender inequality literature that I opened with, this concept of gendered constraints and role performances, I see as an additional mechanism that should be taken into account when we're thinking about how gender influences whether or if managers support these policies and how that varies by their gender. And secondly, I see the paper as contributing to literature on flexible work policies. So in particular, there's some literature that talks about, why is there a failure of flexible work policies to proliferate? This existed before the pandemic, but even during the pandemic, some organizations have rolled back these policies, and there's a question of why. And while, there's many reasons for this and varied reasons, here I'm raising also the importance of considering managers, gendered constraints in their role and how that could inform whether or not they support a given policy, and more broadly, like a focus on managers' day-to-day carrying out of their work tasks. So I'm done. I have a little time left over. I talk really quick. So.
Great, thank you. Megan, you're up next.
All right, let me see my screen here. Great, okay, and I will also start the timer here, so I'm under the 10 minutes here, at maybe the 10 minutes. Okay, so the work I'm presenting today is joint work with Jasmina Chauvin, who's at Georgetown, and Raj Choudhury at HBS, entitled "Where in the World is My Virtual Headquarters?" And in particular, kind of trying to motivate this slide. I think this comes as this comes as a surprise to absolutely no one, that if we look at this kind of top line of this Gallup survey done recently, that the percentage of jobs being done exclusively remotely in the pre-pandemic as compared to earlier this year, and then sort of anticipated into the sort of steady state future, has at least tripled, maybe more than that. So we're looking at, of remote capable employees, something like a steady state of an anticipated quarter of employees working exclusively remotely. And we sort of use this as a jumping out point, because what we're thinking about is kind of historically an organization that had a physical location, a headquarters per se, and the role that that headquarters performed, now in the context of the absence of that physical space. And I should, I guess, lead off this presentation with also saying that this is a theory development paper, so I'm not going to be presenting data on any organization specifically. We've done a little bit of simulated data, but this is kind of trying to anticipate how this will work in these remote organizations. So the question we ask with this paper is, how should we conceptualize of the location of a headquarters in all remote firms? And more specifically, the reason that we care about kind of coordinate or conceptualizing of that location is because we're trying to think about what happens to the headquarters role as the center of coordination. So we know that this historic place has been the place that coordination happens. Now that we don't have this place, how do we think about how coordination happens in the absence of the place? And if we look kind of historically at the literature on headquarters, mostly situated in the IB literature, there's been remarkable consistency on what a headquarters is. A headquarters is traditionally been a set of co-located individuals that are coordinating the main functions of the firm. An implicit part of this co-location is that it has been a single location. Though I'd say in the past probably 10 or so years, there's been sort of an expansion of considering 2 to 3 to 5 locations, but still sort of a handful of locations as the headquarters location. And why is this headquarters important? Well, it serves a whole host of functions, but not just sort of the coordination, really the location itself lends institutional, legal, and cultural customs to the firm. So how do we think about this in the context of remote, and particularly what's the problem of remote? Well, I think we all know that the physical location itself evaporates, but the complication of remote can be well illustrated by this organization DOIS, for which Amir S., the founder and CEO, splits time between Spain and Chile. Alan C., the COO, spends time full-time in Denmark, and Gonzalo S., the CTO, spends time full-time in Portugal. So we see kind of two problems here. One is that people become spread out. The leadership team especially becomes spread out. But two, a second problem here that they're spread out in a way that's dynamic. If we think about specifically the organizations that have physical buildings or physical locations, maybe there's some movement around the fringe, but really there's a static building somewhere, and maybe very occasionally does that building move. In contrast here to Amir S., who spends some split of the year in two different locations. So here we really have this question of how should we conceptualize the location of the headquarters of DOIS? And what we're doing is borrowing a concept from physics, which is the concept of a barycenter, to try and calculate and conceptualize of a headquarters. The barycenter is the point around which two bodies in space orbit. So if we think of this picture on the top here, the sun and Jupiter, the barycenter of the sun and Jupiter is the point around which the sun and Jupiter orbit. This is similar in geometry to the concept of a centroid. Really what this is the center of mass, or sort of the weighted average of the X and Y coordinates. So I have a sort of toy example here of 3 employees, not unlike our 3 employees in the DOIS example, and we can look at a barycenter as being the mean weighted average of the X and Y coordinates. And by mean weighted, we can use different weights associated with each employee. And right now we're conceptualizing those weights as their relative value in coordinating the functions of the organization. So you might weight those based on email communications, you might weight those based on hierarchical levels, you might use many things to try and generate those weights. So I've sort of quickly moved from here's a problem, here's our solution, here's a way we could deal with this. Now I want to say kind of 2 things about the way that the barycenter could help. The first of which is this proposition 1. This is a proposition related to the concept of a barycenter pulled directly from astrophysics. 1, the total distance of employees to the organizational barycenter of a firm is proportional to the level of inter-firm coordination costs faced by that firm. In particular, I think a nice summary of this is to say something like, if we use the average distance to the barycenter, that tells us something about what we're going to say is inter-firm coordination costs. Proposition 2, an employee's distance to the organizational barycenter of the firm is proportional to the level of inter-firm coordination costs faced by that particular focal employee. This, said in a simpler way, is that the variance of distance of each of kind of the sum of individuals to that barycenter is also going to give us some information about proportionally someone who's further away versus closer to the barycenter, their own coordination costs. And why is this valuable at all? Well, the first thing that we think it does is it gives us a way to categorize remote firms in a quantitative way. So rather than just being remote or in person or hybrid, we can kind of examine the extent to which a firm might be considered geographically or hyper dispersed. So on the upper left-hand side here, we have what we might think of as a traditional headquarters. We can think of this as people being in relatively close proximity to one another. There's a relatively low mean distance to barycenter and a low standard deviation. Everyone is close to the barycenter. This is in contrast to panel B below it, where we call this something like a selectively dispersed headquarters. A lot of employees are in one location, and then a handful of people are maybe spread out. So a lot of people are in New York, a handful of people are spread out throughout the rest of the country. So it would be a relatively low average distance or low mean distance to the barycenter, but a higher standard deviation. Moving to panel C, a regionalized headquarters, we can think of this as an organization that maybe operates by country. So people are relatively close to one another within country, but then maybe countries are spread out throughout the globe. Relatively higher distance, average distance to the Berry Center, but lower mean. So everyone is a bit far away from the Berry Center. And the last one, the hyper dispersed headquarters. This might be what people have in mind as kind of the default when they think of remote. So scattered around the globe, no one is close to very many other people. This is sort of the example of automatic: high mean distance to Berry Center, high variance in distance to Berry Center. Some people seem to be relatively close to how coordination happens. Some people seem very far away from sort of the locus of coordination. So we have this tool to categorize. We have these kind of archetypes that we've put out. And the second thing we do is that these archetypes give us a way to think about coordination, which is the original thing that we thought the headquarters was doing, is helping with coordination. So in the traditional low mean, low variance headquarters, we're going to see an increase in technology moderated communication, but perhaps few meaningful differences otherwise. In the selectively dispersed headquarters, we might still see synchronous ongoing work moderated by ICT, but those people that are selectively dispersed are at higher risk of isolation and may end up working time shifted hours in order to be synchronous. Regionalized headquarters, this is where you will see a modularization of work. So modularized probably within those pods, and tacit coordination mechanisms being built at the regional level. Anyone outside of those local co-locations is going to affect isolation. The last one here, hyper dispersion, extreme modularization of work, asynchronous communications. And then this is where you might see those remote organizations that co-locate for a week every year or a week every quarter in order to generate tacit coordination mechanisms through that time and space commonality. And lastly, I think I have 2 seconds, but I'm going to highlight sort of one set of contributions here, which I think is particularly important, which is the practical implications for 3 types of stakeholders. So firms that are planning technology investments to support virtual headquarters. This gives us a sense that not all virtual headquarters need the same type of investment. HR managers that might be trying to manage these employees relatively close or relatively far from the Berry Center. And lastly, an individual trying to figure out where they should locate given a firm's particular sort of dispersion and Berry Center. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Megan. Victoria.
Okay, I will share my slides as well. Can everybody see them? Second. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'll set my timer as well. All right, so thank you so much for having us. Thank you to Peter for putting the session together and to the leader organizers for hosting us. So I'm going to present joint work with Raj Choudhury and at HBS and Sujin Jang at INSEAD, looking at how temporary co-location shapes the performance of remote workers. So as no doubt will be no surprise to any of you here that there's been a number of recent studies looking at how the move from in-office work to remote work has impacted the productivity of workers. And we've seen sort of significant causal impact of work on worker performance of moving to remote work. So workers are maybe more productive, more happy, more satisfied with their jobs. At the same time, there's been a long-standing set of research looking at distributed teams and the extent to which teams sometimes do actually benefit from coming together for site visits, company retreats, and sort of temporary co-location that tends to improve their innovation, creativity, and also strengthen the bonds among workers. And of course, increasingly, as we emerge from this pandemic, organizations are really struggling to understand how to move to this hybrid work setup. How often should workers show up to the office? How should that co-location be structured? What exactly do we really want to get out of that interaction? And so in this paper, what we're interested in exploring is how does temporary co-location impact the remote worker performance? And unlike some of the previous work, what we're going to be looking at is an organization that was actually born remote. So this firm was remote also prior to COVID and had workers already spread around across 30 countries or so in different time zones. And as is common in such organizations, most of their work has already been done asynchronously on messaging apps such as Slack, where they sort of coordinate all of their tasks, communicate, and so forth. But also, like many remote remote organizations, they also come together to these occasional company retreats where the entire organization gets together for a few days to socialize, interact, meet each other, but also kind of set out the vision for the organization, the strategy, and so forth going forward. And so what we're interested in this paper is looking at this organization in terms of how the worker performance is impacted by the attendance of these workers to the retreats. And building on prior work, we would expect that such attendance would improve workers' subsequent performance because it helps them sort of foster these bonds among workers. But specifically, we're also more interested in the types of workers who would benefit more from this. And so what we're going to look at in this presentation in particular is the extent to which worker performance is interdependent with that of their colleagues. So how much do I depend on my colleagues for my performance? And we're going to predict that those workers are the ones that are going to be particularly benefiting from such temporary co-location. So we're going to focus on a specific subgroup of workers. This organization produces software for organizations, and often the customers come to their organization with certain problems and bugs. And these are often time sensitive. And so the organization has a team of workers who are these specialists, technical specialists, who have to resolve these bugs in an ongoing manner. And they have a set of overlapping schedules, and it's all really well structured to make sure there's always somebody on call. Typically, these kinds of bugs are not straightforward. They can take hours and sometimes days to resolve, but usually there's one specific worker who's kind of the owner of this bug, if you will, and is responsible for resolving it. However, when the pandemic hit, in many regions, governments imposed really strict regulations on mobility, they've closed workspaces, they've also closed schools and so forth. And of course, these workers are already remote. They're working remotely, and so this is not affecting them specifically. But for many of them, they have families, they have children who now actually rely on the same workspace and often interrupt their workflow as they go through the day in unpredictable ways. And what we've observed in this organization, what's happening is that for many workers, their schedules are no longer as structured and no longer as predictable as before. And so now when they are trying to resolve some bug that a customer has reported, suddenly they need to drop everything, go attend to something, and they need their colleagues to coordinate with so that they can take over and resolve these customer queries in a timely manner. And so we're going to use the stringency of government intervention with regards to COVID as a measure of the interdependence among workers. So since these workers are spread across different geographies, we can use the fact that both COVID cases, but also the response of government to COVID has varied quite a bit across these regions. And so we're going to look at workers who have been particularly affected by these changes in government response and those who have not. And we will expect those who have been particularly affected to benefit even more from the pre-COVID attendance to these kinds of retreats. Okay, so we're going to collect a number of variables. We're going to collect variables on worker performance. So we have both the manager evaluation of workers, but also their objective performance in terms of how many bugs do they solve, how quickly, and so forth. We also have measures on their retreat attendance. And specifically, we also have their flight schedules that are relatively random, and they're carpooling to and from the airport and the retreat. And I'll explain how that's going to play into our results shortly. We also collect all their Slack communications. So we can observe all the communications among these workers for 5 months before the retreat and then 6 months after. And importantly, the retreat happens in January of 2020. So it's just a month before COVID sort of breaks out, and then we can follow them for the subsequent year. We also have their department, their location, time zone, tenure, past work experience, gender, and so forth. And we're going to use data from the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker, which is a super detailed index of all of the different changes that governments are implementing in terms of how they're trying to manage that pandemic. And it's specific by region, and even within countries, you can have specific regional differences. So just to preview very briefly what our main findings are. So the first finding, and perhaps not surprisingly, we find that on a matched sample of workers, matched on their pre-retreat performance, the number of past retreats they've attended, their tenure, their department, and a number of other characteristics, we find that retreat attendance is positively associated with their post-retreat performance. So indeed, there seems to be some benefits of attending retreats as a worker, even if you're fully remote. However, when we delve a little deeper into what types of workers benefit the most, we actually find that most of the benefits stem from workers who in the subsequent period after the retreat have faced a lot of these disruptions. So COVID has really disrupted the schedules that they had and made them rely much, much more on their colleagues. And in trying to kind of understand what the mechanisms behind this is, why is it the case that this interdependence is changing the effect of the colocation on worker performance, we look at the Slack communications. And specifically, we collect 3 types of variables. We'll look at the volume of communications, so the number of messages that workers actually send to their colleagues. But then we also look at helping behaviors, the extent to which workers reach out to their colleagues for help and advice. And finally, we also collect data on the use of emojis, which we think is a particularly neat way of trying to capture the extent to which people have friendly relationships with one another and also inject some emotion into these messages, make them less formal. And we find again that on a matched sample of workers, retreat attendance itself is positively associated with the volume of communications and also the extent to which workers use emojis. But perhaps even more interestingly, even very, very short periods of colocation. So we're looking at a half an hour Uber ride from the airport to the retreat location and vice versa, has a strong and significant impact on the extent to which workers then post more messages on Slack channels, ask more questions, and also have more emotional cues in their messages. And kind of trying to understand the extent to which this might be a potential driver of the impact of the retreats on performance, we find that the messages are particularly important for those workers who face a lot of these restrictions by governments. So for those who post a lot of questions and also are in these regions that have been particularly affected by stringent restrictions, benefit the most from their communications, and similarly with emojis. So both in terms of asking for help, and emojis tend to help workers, especially those who are more reliant on their coworkers. So in sum, what we're finding is that yes, there is a general effect of retreat attendance or sort of these temporary co-location events on worker performance, and they tend to be also moderated by the extent of interdependence. And so far, we're seeing some evidence that this may have to do with the extent to which workers are willing to ask for help among their colleagues, but also the extent to which they develop these social relationships and are willing to display some emotion in this. And we hope that this work can help inform organizations as they struggle with trying to understand exactly how to structure hybrid work. Who should be coming into the office more? How should that communication be structured? Should we try to engage workers more in particular types of communications that might be especially helpful to them? So in the next step, this is still very much an early stage work. What we're trying to explore is additional measures of the communications, things like the topics that people discuss, the sentiment, conflict resolution, and so forth. And we're also looking for alternative measures of interdependence. So if anybody has any feedback on that, I'd love to hear that. But that's all. Thank you very much. And I think I have no time left. So
Thank you. That's perfect. Peter, rounding us out.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen and begin. Oops, at the beginning. Okay, so this is joint work with Chris Erickson called Institutional and Task Teleworkability Before and After the COVID-19 Pandemic. This is a project we've been working on, I'd say, almost since the start of the pandemic when we began asking this question about what explains change in the workplace that has been impacted by information and communication technologies. So we wrote a paper that was theoretical that laid out some hypotheses around how we think institutions will affect the future of remote work. Specifically, we developed ideas about licensing bodies and unions and other things that we then realized we would like to test with some empirical data. So this is a follow-up to that work where we were able to obtain some data and trying to really figure out what makes jobs teleworkable and what is the role of institutional factors in shaping the teleworked outcomes that we are seeing. So if you looked at the newspaper or Twitter today and you saw that Elon Musk announced that all employees must return to the office, what I think we would say about that is I think not that it's a trend or necessarily we hear often that there's a trend. The future of work is going to be more remote or hybrid, or that for creativity and innovation, you need to have people back in the office. These may be very individual company to company decisions led by idiosyncratic factors is essentially the point of looking into the institutional context in which these decisions are made. So I want to just begin to tell you a little bit about the data and what it's going to show. We're looking at job advertisements, and we're looking at the text of the job advertisement and whether it specifically indicates that the job can be performed remotely, either full-time or hybrid. And what you see here is a 11-year essentially time series of remote work jobs within the burning glass corpus of data. And I'll talk a little bit more about the data in a minute. But essentially, we know that COVID has dramatically increased the prevalence of remote work options for many workers. But a lot of that was temporary. And so when we're looking at job advertisement text, one thing to keep in mind, and this is also the flow of new job advertisements each month, what percentage of them are offering remote or hybrid options, okay? So that's certainly increased, but we think that the job ad is particularly interesting because it is, in a way, a psychological contract, a promise to a worker that you can be remote. So we're looking at why remote work essentially changed before and after the pandemic. What are some of the factors? Now, theoretically, a lot of the explanation has focused, especially during the COVID pandemic period or the immediate crisis after March 2020, on the occupational-based scales. And there's a number of research papers that have looked at how whether a job's occupation is teleworkable or not is linked to the outcome of the job being telework. And what we really want to emphasize is that assumption or that idea carries some predictions for what would happen after COVID. In one perspective, you might think that, okay, jobs that are task teleworkable, that the occupation can be done remotely, have already largely been done remotely. And the criteria for task teleworkable here is that the job can be done at high quality at a distance. So after COVID, you wouldn't expect to see a huge jump, okay? But another perspective would say that jobs that are task teleworkable were largely not made remote before COVID. And so you'd expect to see a large jump after COVID. In contrast, we want to talk a little bit about our perspective here, the institutional teleworkability perspective we're trying to develop. And it builds off of a large literature on institutional change in employment relations, how changes become layered, are punctuated, are involved renegotiations of social contracts at work. So we focused in on a few specific factors that include organizational politics and policy. You know, is there a will within the organization, and do the interests of the parties align to make work remote? Because you have to have often a telework agreement between worker, manager, and it all has to be sanctioned within a organizational or institutional structure. We look at changing business models as more businesses are adopting independent contractor business models and not having an employment relationship. That has implications for whether work will be done remotely. In addition, there are lobby groups and interest groups, including workers' representatives, unions, and professional associations and licensing bodies that speak to the interests of the workers. And if workers want to have remote work and their bodies represent their interests, then we might think that that would lead to more remote work before the pandemic. Now, the prediction for the post-pandemic period is that, first of all, from this perspective, the effective task teleworkability should not really be that large. It doesn't determine the outcome. We think instead that it's these characteristics of the institutional environment and the context around a job that makes a job teleworkable. We would expect to see large differences between firms. We would expect that the institutions don't change overnight just because the pandemic is a major event and government policy changes. But you know, as a result, if we were running a regression, which we do, you know, we would expect to see a negative or no, really small effect of institutions after the pandemic, but larger before. So this project has taken us a while to get the data together because we started with really the raw text of the job advertisement, and we extracted characteristics of that, including all of the institutional characteristics that we're looking at, the job characteristics. At 3:15, I'll be talking about how to do that, but it's a whole process to get to where we are now, where we're able to look at this in pictures like this. So just to illustrate, for example, a task teleworkable job before and after the pandemic was more likely to be offered remote. So that offers some evidence in support of the view that task teleworkability is important. Now, in addition, we want to look at something. This is just a F ratio. If we look at the variance according to groups in whether or not a job is worked remote, what you're seeing there in that blue line, the one that jumps off the screen, the one that jumps after COVID, that's the firm level. What that says is that there's a lot of variation at the firm level, less so at occupation, teleworkability of the job, union status, and the other factors we're looking at. Our measures, we have a number of them, including our work from home measure. We have a task teleworkability measure based on the ONET scale about the duties of a particular job. We look at whether or not a job is for a federal government agency. This is because of the Telework Enhancement Act in 2010, a little known piece of legislation that actually, it turns out, has a large effect on whether or not workers in that organization in the federal government can work from home. We look at whether or not a job is for a 1099 independent contractor, whether it requires a professional license, whether the job indicates that you are a member of a bargaining unit. And we also have a variable in our regressions for the period after the March 2020 onset of the restrictions from COVID. Our baseline model, and I will say I did put our paper up on the box if you would love, we would love to hear any feedback and comments. We're still developing this. What we're just going to look at are the simple effects, okay, of each of these, the effect of COVID, effect of licensing, union, and so forth. And then we're going to interact COVID with all of our institutional and task teleworkability variables. And we're going to look at the effect after COVID in addition to before. This table, I want to draw your attention to just a couple of things. The results are pretty consistent across the board, but before COVID, unions working for the federal government, independent contractor, all had large, positive, significant effects on whether or not a job was offered remote. Teleworkability also matters here, but in terms of magnitude, you can see, for example, that working for the federal government really has a much larger impact or increase in your odds of having a remote job, for example, than even being in a teleworkable job. And on the column on the right, I just want to highlight that if we look at firm level variance, and again, we control for firms, just at that firm level, we see a lot of the variation being explained there, much more so than if we look at the occupations, the sectors, and other characteristics of a job. So with that, I believe I'm just about at time, and thank you. Look forward to comments. And thanks everyone, and thank you, Elise and Tomas, for comments, for everything. Thanks.
Great, well within time. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'll start sharing my screen. Is it working just fine?
Yes.
Thanks. So I am timing myself as of now. So first of all, thanks, thanks Peter and Elise for organizing this session. It's a pleasure to, read a lot of papers that are in the stage of development that I feel like my comments may be slightly useful. Hopefully they will be so. So I'd just like to first, the first slide, get a sense of what have we seen during this hour. And I think we've seen is that flexible remote work is a multi-layered agenda. So we have on one hand, the paper by Megan, which focuses a little bit on, that's my reading of Megan's paper with Jasmina and Raj. It's more of a corporate strategy, firm worker location, so a very macro level question on what is the organizational bar center, how that can affect both employee location, but also firm strategy. Then we move to Peter's paper, we're looking across firms and different occupations and choices in terms of whether I'm going to offer remote work or not. We go one level down to Victoria's paper with Raj and Yang on a strategy of a firm and how that affects the performance and communication channels within the firm, which I would label more of inside their econometrics type of paper. And lastly, we have Vanessa's paper on this worker level support for policy. So we're really looking at the individual level, worker level attributes. And that's how I put these papers together. So they just show that this topic can have a wildly large application across different fields of management scholarship. And then having said that, I'm going to go from top down on some basic comments about each one of those papers. Hopefully they will be useful. So starting with Megan's papers. So I let out 3 key strengths that I think deserve highlighting when you submit this paper as you push this project forward. And one is that it is a project can affect multiple areas of management. So you can see organizational barrier center as being something that determines employee firm's choice. but also organizational design and firm strategy and HR and even top management team, because if I understood correctly, the Barry Center depends on the weight of each employee in terms of interaction within the firm. So I feel like that's a topic that can be highlighted up front. It's kind of like a big umbrella upon which we can draw multiple different papers out of. I think it's a creative use of an already existing, and at least I found easy to understand measure. So I think that's a plus. So it's not tricky. And I really like the typology. I really like the comprehensive typology you went through. I think it applies to firms that are not even fully distributed. So you can tie it up with just regular headquarter location literature, as you already do, and as we know, we both know it's Jasmina's specialty. So I think it's a really good aspect of the paper. Some aspects that I think you could push forward. And my view of the paper is, I know that you said it's a theory piece. I read it as a new measure paper. So it's a new measure that you're trying to push forth and that may be relevant to firms, which is the Barry Center. And if that is the case, at least that's my reading, and I know that you didn't say so, but that's my reading, it will be really important to have a real world validation. So is it anyhow correlated with employee performance, choices of firm? Can you replicate some of the findings from this headquarter literature? I can imagine different ways of doing this. You can work like GitHub teams, co-author teams, things that you can kind of like apply just to show that. And I know you're laughing because I gave you this feedback at a different point in time. So yes, so I think that could be interesting. Another question is, how would these different forms of coordination affect the Barr Center? Because if the measure depends on the weight of the individual, you have to affect like what affects the weight. Is it directional or bidirectional communication? How do you account for a hierarchy when you compute the mass? So it's a little bit tricky as of now to understand how you would apply the concept. And also the current focus is on coordination cost, but I think you could go beyond and talk about like productivity, innovativeness, heterogeneity across tasks. So we saw that paper, I think it's in the Nature, that's showing that remote work is really good for idea selection, but not that great for idea creation, for ideation. And that will, I think that decision of the outcome variable will say, is this an org design paper, it's a strategy paper, or BHR. I think that's, those are my three suggestions. Moving to Peter's paper. So main strengths, I really like not going to the non-technical aspects of remote work. So I like that you're not working with ONET. And yes, I also mentioned Musk's recent request. So I think that's a plus. And I mean, myself being Brazilian, I don't particularly like papers that assume ONET describe how occupations work in the world. I can tell, pretty sure it doesn't work in Brazil. I like the use of burning glass. I think it's a data set that has not been fully utilized in management scholarship. We've seen economists using more and more, and maybe some people in labor schools, but I think you can push this forth as a novelty, maybe trying to get a comparison with European burning glass and compare to ONET-based classifications. And I think, again, also it's interesting because it cuts across different subfields of management scholarship and even economics. Some suggestions should push the project further. I think my question is like, we still don't know what is the post-COVID equilibrium of teleworking. Firms are still learning which jobs will be fully remote, which ones will not be fully remote. So it brings the question of how dynamically consistent is the measure you're constructing. And because we don't really know what's going in the back end of the machine learning algorithm, we don't really know if we're going to be able to replicate the measure, I don't know, 3 months from now. So I think that's something to think about. Maybe one way of reframing instead of institutional teleworking is about thinking about potential versus realized teleworkability. So you have a technical classification. I don't think ONET is bad by default. You have a technical classification of which jobs can be teleworkable, but the question is which institutional elements drive the utilization of this potential? It tells us, for instance, for some reason Musk decided not to utilize this potential. And I think that's a way to broaden the framing of and make it more usable across different fields. So this idea of realized potential of teleworkability. And that this brings a lot of opportunity in terms of like what explains this cross-firm variation in this utilization of the teleworkability potential. Is it size, maturity, startups versus non-startups, structure, innovativeness? Is it just inertia? And I think you hint some of the elements on page 9 of your manuscript. I think I would like to see that if you can push a little bit more on that. Going to Victoria, I think that the main strengths are the uniqueness of certain aspects of the interaction. I really like the forced semi-random interactions in ride sharing. It's kind of like you see movies and you think like, you see movies and people kind of like fighting over who's going to sit by the CEO on the airplane. I think that would be a great way to motivate the paper if you have like one sentence about that. I think that's interesting. In terms of the strategy framing, I think you can do a little bit about working on this idea of creating organizational resilience in times of crisis. I think that would be one way to frame that could be interesting. If you want to go through OT framing, I think you have a richness of the communication data, and you can see different communication styles, how they strategize, how to communicate depending on whether they met the person or not, if they're more formal or less formal. I think that would be more an OT framing. I like the strategy framing a little bit better, but that's my bias. And some suggestions, and I'm going to put a qualitative hat here. The data is very detailed, but has a very small n. So, and throughout the presentation was like, okay, give me more of what Vanessa gave me. Give me more of the nitty gritty, talk to people. Apparently it's not a super large organization. You can hire an RA, you can do some interviews, some surveys to get a more colorful idea of the mechanisms. I think that would be, at least for me, would be a higher marginal value added than like a lot of machine learning text analysis. But that's my interpretation. One thing that you started doing is, but I think you could push further, is examine this different ex-ante expected values of communication. So what is it about ride sharing with the CEO or with some from a joining team versus not? Where is the in-person interaction a horizontal interaction or vertical interaction? I think that can give some interesting insights on how this in-person communications translate into virtual communications. And that connects to the last point. I felt like you could do something at the dyad level, all potential network, putting communication in the firm, instead, because then this would augment your N in a way that would make the analysis a little bit more interesting. And you can see changes in the shape of the network, centrality, different structural holes, who people are communicating with. This could also help with point one in painting this more colorful picture. And last but not least, Vanessa's paper. I am a quantitative scholar, so I'm starting with that. I am not a gender scholar. I'm starting with that as well. So what I really like as a quantitative scholar, I really like how clear the protocol was. I think that won my heart from the get-go. I understood what you did, even though it's an ethnographic work, which is not where I find myself most comfortable in. I really like the dynamic perspective of the career of the individual, building the managerial style, building the informal authority and their skills, and how that would affect their reactions to remote work arrangements. I really like this mechanism. I think that's the key part of the paper. And I like the non-obvious elements that intersects DEI and remote work. As a non-gender scholar, I truly think that this is not a gender paper. This is a paper about managerial style and authority and how they react to remote work. I think it's a characteristic that's unevenly distributed, and that's fair. But the mechanisms goes deeper than gender. I think that's my perspective. If I were reading the paper and evaluating the paper. One thing that also considers that what you're measuring is a short-term reaction to loss of a valuable human capital, which is how how to do personal relationships. But there could be a long-term reaction of women or people who don't have or who only have an informal managerial authority. They could learn how to build this long-distance relationships. So I feel like your story comes to the short-term reaction, but it doesn't particularly encompass the long-term reaction. So it would be nice to have this as a discussion point, or see if people learn over time. So these women learn over time how to be personable online. And lastly, this is my quantitative hat. You have data, you can do some QCA with existing coded data based on like the findings that you could use descriptive evidence. So that data exists in employer-employee match data sets. That you can use this to push further, so you can give a broader, generalizability of the findings. And I'm 1 minute past, so thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that those are great comments. If any of the authors wish to respond, you can have up to a minute to respond to anything, or if you had anything else you wanted to say, responding to the other papers, if not the discussant. If not, then I will open it up to audience questions. If you're in the audience, you have a question, please feel free to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask your question. We are in the room together.
So may I ask actually a question to Peter? I'd be curious to know how you measure the remote work. So is the measure trying to capture the policy of the company or mainly the workability of it remotely? And kind of what's the process of using job ads? I'm just curious because I also use job ads for some research. So it would be great to understand a little more. Thank you.
Sure. So I realize I flashed the regression on the screen real fast, but it's a regression with 60 million job advertisements for the 2 years prior to March 2020. And it's a job ad level measure. All of these measures are job ad levels. And we know the company that they're in, so we can add firm effects. We know the occupation of the job, so we can add occupation fixed effects and so forth. How do we construct a measure like that and these other measures that are characteristics of the context around a job? Basically, the process involves sampling the raw text from keywords and then writing rules that we then extrapolate over the larger data set to create a training data set for machine learning if desired, or if we can exactly specify the rules, then don't need to do machine learning. But that's the general approach that we use to create that. But come at 3:15 to the session on text and data, and I'll have another 9 minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Victoria, just one question. What was the selection criteria for individuals to join the retreat? That was a little bit unclear, and that sounds like a relevant point.
Absolutely. So I think one of the challenges that we have with using the full company retreat is that it is not random on who attends. So there are some people, most people attend, but there is a significant subgroup that does not, largely for personal reasons. So these are things like expecting a baby, moving house, and so on. The way that we try to get around that is through matching on observables, but that is by no means a perfect method. And so I still find those results mainly as correlational. I would not call them causal, if you will. I think the Uber rides are definitely far more random. In fact, we've tried to see any patterns for what predicts who you share an Uber ride with, and it's more or less entirely random. But the company does have other retreats. And so what we're thinking about doing is seeing if we can use some of these others as a robustness check on the main result.
Vanessa, I was curious for you if you found any kind of along the lines of what Tomas said, any non-conforming gender responses to the kind of dichotomy that you set out. You set it out as sort of like the dichotomy of gender, but I could imagine what Tomas is saying, that this is an effect based on management style, perhaps, or
yeah, so I originally wrote the paper the way Tomas is suggesting, and my reviewers did not want me to do it that way. So now it is focused on gender foremost. And I did find exceptions, like off diagonal, so to speak. So I had 47 managers. There were I think something like 6 or 7 male managers who opposed the policy. 3 of them, I can't remember the exact numbers, were minorities, like ethnic minorities. Not every man who was an ethnic or racial minority opposed the policy, but some did, and for reasons similar to what the woman said in the paper, which were, and I didn't talk about this in my 10 minutes, but particularly difficulties having their authority recognized. So in the paper, I actually talk about this technical and client skill development difficulty and authority recognition difficulty. I only focus on the former here because we have 10 minutes. And then for women, the exception were those that were pushed, or not pushed, but who were able through various means to became more technical and client skill focused. And then they were supportive of the policy. So it's not, a little to Tomas' point, not gender per se, but it is, mechanisms in gender inequality that lead to the disproportionate amount of women in one group and the men in the other. So I'd originally written the paper where I lead with there's differences in styles, or if they have this gender basis. And the reviewers wanted the gender up first. So now that is how the paper is at this point. So yes.
I am not sure reviewers, but I disagree. I think the managerial style is
That's
much
fine. You can argue with the second round answer.
Yeah, no, I won't be a reviewer, so do whatever they say.
Yeah, no, it's fine. And I honestly went both ways with writing the paper, and I feel comfortable talking about it or framing it in both ways. I think both ways represent the data fine. So yeah.
Sounds like you can make 2 different papers out of it.
Yes. I have a lot of papers out of it, so.
Well, I think this closes out unless any of the panelists have any closing remarks they'd like to make. Can open it up. Well, thank you all for a very interesting session, and I look forward to the next versions of all of your papers.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.